We'll be discussing his latest book, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. It is a really interesting book in which Professor Nye uniquely uses an ethical dimension to evaluate the leadership qualities of all the 14 US presidents from 1945 to 2020. It's already got many excellent reviews, and the link to purchase will be available in the video description. The way this will work is that Professor Nye will open for around 25 minutes, in which he will talk about the book, followed by a Q&A discussion centered around the book and on soft power as well. Professor Nye, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Adil. It's a pleasure to be with you. Frankly, right now in the frozen north of New Hampshire, I'd rather be in Western Australia. People ask me sometimes, why did I write a book called Do Morals Matter? And the general view is that when you talk about international politics, morals don't matter much. The saying goes, it's all national interest. National interest bakes the cake, so to speak, and then politicians come along and sprinkle a little moral icing on it to make it look pretty, but it doesn't matter much. Indeed, I remember once when I was working in the State Department after a long day of negotiations on nuclear issues, saying to a French diplomat, do you ever get bothered or worried about the moral implications of what we're discussing? And his response was, no, it doesn't matter at all. The only thing that matters is the interests of France. And I think he didn't realize what a profound moral judgment he had just made. But that's rather typical. Even if you look at the current world situation, where we're about to be rid of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was known for his slogan of America First. And while you can fault Trump as one of the most amoral presidents we've had, the slogan America First is not wrong per se. I would expect that in France that Emmanuel Macron has to say French interests first. After all, elected leaders are elected in democracies to protect the interests of their followers. So in that sense, it's not national interest that's the problem. It's how you define the national interest. And you can define a national interest rather narrowly or very narrowly if I win, you lose, sort of narrow transactions one by one, which is what Trump did. Or you can define it rather broadly of it's in my interest, but it's in your interest too. And we'll work on situations where we can find those joint interests. And that is a difference of how morality plays. It's not, do you ignore the national interest? It's, do you define the national interest in a broad way? For example, in the current pandemic situation, you could take a national interest situation where you say, I'll vaccinate all my people before I look at anybody else. Or you can say, I will reserve, let's say, 20% of my vaccine for first responders and health professionals in poor countries with weak public health systems. Now, you could say, how could you ever give away vaccine to others before you've taken care of every last person at home? And you could also interpret your national interest as saying, look, we're never going to get rid of this threat of pandemics until other countries have better health systems and more robust health systems. So when we help them, we're helping ourselves. In that sense, if you look back historically, Harry Truman defined America's national interest at the times after World War II in a way where America gave away 2% of its gross domestic product in the Marshall Plan to help Europe recover. But the view was that was in our interest to protect Europe from becoming communist, but it was in the European interest as well. So that's what I mean, that you can have moral issues involved in how broadly or narrowly you define the national interest. Let me, people say, well, that's all very good and theoretical, but it doesn't really matter when you look back historically. And what I try to do in the book is to show that If you take the cynical view that morals don't matter, you're going to get history wrong. That basically, in looking over the history of these 14 presidents and their foreign policy, I find that their moral views actually made quite a difference to how things turned out, for better and for worse. Let me go back to Harry Truman to give you an example. When many people criticized Truman for morally for dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, indeed, there was a famous moral philosopher at Oxford who refused to attend an honorary degree ceremony for Truman in 1948, based on the grounds that he had used nuclear weapons. Truman basically did not know much about nuclear weapons when he dropped the bombs. He knew or was told that you'd have a great loss of life from the invasion of the Japanese home islands. And he felt that it was better to drop the bomb and get the war to end quickly than to prolong it. But it's interesting that there was a third bomb, which was located on Tinian Island in the Pacific. And Truman told the military not to drop it. He said, I'm not going to kill that many more women and children. In other words, as he saw the effects in Hiroshima, he basically said, not again. And even more importantly, in 1950, when the Americans were about to lose the Korean War, we had pushed our troops up near the Chinese border. Then the Chinese crossed the Yalu River and pushed us back down the peninsula. And Douglas MacArthur, who was the American commander in East Asia, said to Truman, if you allow me to drop 20 atomic bombs on Chinese cities, I will win this war for you. And Truman, even though he knew that if the war stalemated, it would prevent him from running for a third term, or actually a second full term as president in 1952. And he said no. He said, we're not going to do this. And moral reasons were a large part of it. Now, it's interesting. Thomas Schelling, the Nobel laureate economist, once said that the nuclear taboo is probably one of the most important developments since 1945. The nuclear taboo, meaning that you didn't use nuclear weapons for warfighting, they were simply for deterrence. And if imagine that Truman had taken a different position and had saved his presidency and won the war by bombing all these Chinese cities, the world today would look quite different. And so in that sense, whether you like the outcome or don't like the outcome, I happen to like the outcome. To argue that morals didn't matter, or that Truman's moral views didn't matter, is simply not to get history correct. And so in that sense, I think in that both the case of Truman, but many of the other 13 presidents besides Truman's that the Americans had since 1945, their moral views made a big difference. And so in that sense, we have to take morality into account when we're to understand how foreign policy works out in politics. Now, if that's true, that morals matter, which is one of the two things I was trying to prove in writing this book, the second problem is even harder, which is, how should we think about morals? What's the right way to approach this? And there's a strong tendency in many Americans, at least, to think in terms of what's called American exceptionalism, that if we do it, it's okay. And if others do it, it's not. Or essentially the idea that the intentions are good. And many Americans say, well, we have very good intentions, and therefore if we do it, it means it's all right. An example of this is George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Bush's press spokesman, Ari Fleischer, said that you had to admire Bush's invasion of Iraq because of its pure intentions or its moral intentions. Said Bush was trying to develop a freedom agenda and promote democracy in the Middle East. And that means that it was a good thing or moral foreign policy. I think that's a very shallow way of approaching how we judge morality of presidents or of any moral action. I use a simple example taken from basically what could be everyday life, which is imagine that your daughter was scheduled to do university exams on a Saturday morning, but on a Friday night she went out to a dance, and a friend of yours says, "Oh, I'll pick her up from the dance along with my daughter, and we'll get her home early so she's well rested for the exams." So the friend picks her up at the dance, notices that it's later than intended, decides that to get her home early, he's going to have to speed, doesn't pay much attention to the fact that it's rained and the road is wet and slick, drives too fast, slides off the road, and hits a tree, and your daughter is killed. Would you excuse him because his intentions were good? Of course not. You'd say, look, he used inappropriate means and he didn't pay enough due diligence to the prospect of unintended consequences, which were highly immoral. And that could be said of Bush in Iraq. Even if you grant him the intention of trying to remove Saddam Hussein and to promote a freedom agenda in the Middle East, he didn't pay enough attention to the means. He didn't have the capacity to do that. And by not paying attention to those means, he ignored, for example, papers prepared in the intelligence community in the State Department that warned him about this. And the net result was disastrous. The consequences, even though they were unintended, he didn't pay enough due diligence to the prospect he could run into these unintended consequences. What they led to was not a weakening of Al Qaeda, but a strengthening of Al Qaeda in Iraq. And eventually it morphed into the ISIS, the Islamic State, which had horrible immoral consequences for the region. So in that sense, I argue that when people judge the morality of a foreign policy, they have to go beyond just good intentions, and they have to ask what I call questions of three-dimensional morality. Three-dimensional morality, the three dimensions are, were the intentions good? And second, were the means moral? And third, were the consequences good? And that means you have to ask questions about intentions, not just were they good, but were they practical? Was there enough prudence that you could say that these were practical intentions? And on means, when it comes to the use of force, was there a concern about proportion and discrimination between civilians and combatants? And there's also another dimension of means, which liberal means. Did you use institutions which were respected by others? Did you think about the rights of others? And on consequences, you had to think in terms of just, not just the question of whether it was good for the American people, in the sense, was the president a good trustee of American interests, but also was there a concern about the interests of others, not to harm others to the extent that that was possible. And also, what was the educational effects? Did the president did he set a good moral example for the future or a bad one? So those are the kinds of questions that go into three-dimensional judgments of morality. And it leads you to a different approach or different conclusion than if you just take the simple view of good intentions that I mentioned earlier. What you find is that sometimes people will say, well, but there's no room to balance or weigh these different dimensions. International politics is an issue of survival. And if you don't just do what's necessary for survival, then there are no opportunities for these finer moral judgments. There are some rare circumstances in international politics where that's the case, but they're not that common. I'll give you an example. One of those rare instances was 1940, where Winston Churchill had to face the question of what did he do after Hitler broke through the Ardennes, pushed British forces into the sea at Dunkirk, and threatened to take over the French Navy. And Churchill said, if the French Navy if Hitler takes over the French Navy, the prospects of the Royal Navy defending the British islands is going to be very slim. So he said, I have to do something about it. And he did something which under normal circumstances would be highly immoral. He bombed his ally. The British bombed the French fleet and killed something like 1,300 French sailors. Now, in those circumstances, Churchill's argument was the consequences of not doing this meant that I was going to lose the survival of Britain, and with it, democracy and our values. And I had no choice. And you have to sort of hold your nose in these cases. Well, we sometimes call them lifeboat ethics, as we say that in balancing motives, means, and consequences, this is a very, very hard call. But it doesn't mean that everything in international politics or foreign policy is like that. For example, when Donald Trump was confronted with the evidence that Jamal Khashoggi, who was a dissident Saudi journalist who was working in the US, but went to the consulate, the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and was killed and dismembered by Saudi intelligence forces. The basic reaction that Trump had is, well, that's the way of the world. It's a tough world out there. Get over it. And he said, we've got to sell arms to the Saudis and we've got to buy their oil. In other words, he treated this event as though it was like Hitler taking over the French fleet in 1940, but it wasn't. It didn't mean that in response to the murder of Khashoggi that Trump should have bombed Saudi Arabia, but it does mean he could have recalled the ambassador, or he could have made a strong statement about this being abhorrent, or he could have stopped selling arms to the Saudis, which were being used in the war in Yemen. He did none of those. And even the conservative editorial page of the Wall Street Journal condemned him for not standing up for American values. And those values are important because not only are they intrinsically valuable and important, but they enhance our reputation, our soft power, our ability to get what we want through attraction. So to treat all of international politics as though it's a situation of survival is simply not an accurate description and leads to policies that are totally inadequate. Now, as I look through these various experiences of American presidents since 1945, I said, we have to draw a balance sheet for each of these presidents. And I provide a little scorecard in the book. I said, we have to look at their motives, their means, and their consequences. And sometimes it doesn't all come out right. Henry Kissinger once said that the hardest decisions in foreign policy usually are in the area between 51 and 49%. And so as I judge these presidents, None came out perfectly. None came out totally wrong. But when you sort of weighted these and tried to balance them, I or divided the 14 presidents into three categories. Four I put in the top tier, uh, four I put in the bottom tier, and the rest were stretched out in between. The presidents I thought did the best job in terms of morality and foreign policy were Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush. And the four that I put in the bottom category were uh, Lyndon Johnson because of his mishandling of Vietnam. Um, that's not a judgment on his whole presidency because he was quite good on things like civil rights, but on his foreign policy, he fits in the bottom category. Richard Nixon, again, because of Vietnam, he was basically willing to sacrifice something like 20,000 American troops and uncountless Vietnamese lives for what he called a decent interval between the time that the Americans left and the North Vietnamese took over. I also put George W. Bush in that category because of the Vietnam War, for the reasons, I mean, not the Vietnam, the Iraq War, for the reasons I already mentioned. And I put Donald Trump in that bottom category as well, for a extremely amoral approach to foreign policy. Trump, for example, is an accomplished liar. Now, all presidents have told lies, including those in my top tier, but the Washington Post fact checkers found that Trump told something like 20,000 lies in the first 3 years of his presidency. When you tell that many lies, you debase the currency of trust. And when you debase the currency of trust, you undercut our country's soft power, our ability to get others to follow us because of attraction rather than coercion or payment. So I think Trump belongs in that bottom category as well. The others are stretched out in between with some goods and some bads and differing degrees. But I think to conclude, the thing that I felt most importantly about the book was not whether people agreed with my judgments of the scorecards I gave to each of these presidents, though they're available to anybody to see, but to suggest how people can make their own scorecards. If you take these three dimensions of intentions, means, and consequences, it provides you with a way to cut through the simplistic view that it's either good because the intentions were good or good because it turned out all right, and to make your own judgments on whether you think this is a moral or immoral foreign policy. And that sort of helping people think through for themselves how they make their judgments on morality and foreign policy, as well as simply proving the point that morality made a huge difference historically, is what the book is all about. So it's not that I got the answers all right. It's that in terms of judging particular precedents, it's that I hope to have helped people to make their own judgments in a better way. So that's what the book is about. But I'm looking forward to questions and other perspectives.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Nye. And the first question is, now in your book, you have three pillars: intentions, means, consequences. And intentions, you highlight how intentions is how they clearly articulate their visions and their goals for foreign policy. One, I know you touched about this with a few presidents in the book. One thing I'm curious to know from your studying, from your research to the book and observation over the past few years, both professionally as an academic, can you judge a president's moral performance based on the inauguration speech?
Not really, because the inauguration speech is like a pep talk. It's like a way to rally things. It doesn't tell you what people are going to actually do. Um, John Kennedy talked about ask not what you can what your country can do for you, what you would do for your country. And it was a noble sentiment which motivated a lot of people, but it also led to perhaps an overextension in Vietnam. Donald Trump, in his inaugural speech, talked about not interfering with other countries and just attracting them, the sort of a shining city on a hill approach. Uh, but that's not the way he behaved. The way he behaved at home was in such a way that it dulled the luster of the shining city. So I think we should regard inaugural speeches as aspirational, but not as really indicative of what a president's going to do.
And I was also very, very curious to know is, did you see a big difference in moral performance between presidents who are sitting who are up for re-election versus those in that either in a second term or who are not running for re-election but had no political consequences of their action in regards to what they did? So did you find that those in their first term as opposed to a second term would have were either better performing on moral performance or worse off on moral performance? Did not having to worry about re-election mean they were more free? How did you find that dynamic?
Well, in principle, you'd think that presidents would have more leeway in their second terms because they don't have to face reelection. And but in practice, there are a number of the cases that I studied run the other way. For example, if you look at Jimmy Carter, he took some of his hardest moral decisions in his first term, such as returning the Panama Canal. And many of his advisors said, that's an extraordinarily costly decision for you to make. Wait to your second term. But he didn't. He said, I'm going to get this done. Or to take another example, Barack Obama intervened in Libya in his first term, but refused to intervene in Syria in his second term. So it's not clear to me that what you would think a priori makes sense, that you got freedom in your second term, you do whatever you want. Historically, it doesn't always turn out that way.
Sure. One thing I'm very interested in as well is looking at the dynamic during the Vietnam era, and specifically within LBJ and Gerald Ford. Given the circumstances in which they came to office, LBJ literally had a few hours to prepare before he knew he was going to be president because of JFK. Gerald Ford, again, very, very unique circumstances. Did you use a different lens in analyzing LBJ's first term and Gerald Ford, simply because they didn't really have that much time to articulate a vision because they were just rushed into office given the circumstance?
Well, certainly in Lyndon Johnson's period of following up on Kennedy, he basically, in that case, ducked any questions about Vietnam or decisions about Vietnam until after the '64 election. And he really took the big decisions of, deepening the American involvement in early '65, after he'd been elected. And he'd had a little bit of time to get his feet on the ground by that, but his first decisions from November of '63 until let's say January, February of '65 on Vietnam were quite cautious. So in that sense, maybe inexperience was better, in the sense that his decisions were a little bit better. On Gerald Ford, he didn't have a very long presidency overall, so it's very hard to judge his foreign policy, but he did I think, a pretty good job. He tried to restore a sense of honesty and trust, and he also tried to create conditions for a arms control with the Soviet Union, for strengthening institutions like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Security in Europe. And these may, I mean, in the sense that he, for somebody with short time and no experience, he actually did pretty well for his short time.
And I was quite curious. I know this is more going on the domestic aspect, but I've always found that with Gerald Ford, you briefly touch on um, the issue of pardoning Nixon, and I always fascinated about how it can be viewed both ways morally. Some say it wasn't moral because you pardon somebody who you pardon the person who a lot of people thought what Nixon did was criminal. However, on the other side of the coin is by doing that, Ford was willing to give up essentially a second term because he knew it would be so popular to help the country move on. So, in regards to that, Gerald, how would you analyze that decision to pardon Nixon morally?
Well, my colleague at the Kennedy School, David Gergen, who worked as advisors for four American presidents, including Nixon and Ford, says that he thinks it was a moral decision, that Ford knew that there would be some blowback from it. He didn't expect that it would cancel his bid for a full term, but he did realize there would be pressure against him on it, but that he felt it was better to move on than to basically get lost in recriminations. So I think Gergen's probably right. I think it was a moral decision that Ford took.
And then, do you generally see a trend between a reflection between moral performance on a domestic level and foreign policy level? Do you find that presidents generally tend to be consistent, or do you find that some presidents were extremely moral on the domestic front, but not so moral on the foreign policy front?
Oh, I think there's inconsistency. I mean, the classic there was Lyndon Johnson, who, in his domestic policy of passing the Voting Rights Act, some people have said he did more for African Americans than any president since Abraham Lincoln. And so, in that sense, Johnson's domestic policy is often seen as one which had extraordinarily moral consequences. But Vietnam was just the opposite. It had extremely immoral consequences. So it's ironic that very often what makes you good in one sphere is not in the other. Johnson knew the American domestic scene, knew the American Senate. He was an expert. Robert Cavro, who wrote a definitive biography of Johnson, called one of his volumes about Johnson, The Master of the Senate. But when it came to foreign affairs, Johnson was not comfortable. He wasn't at home. He didn't feel at ease. He didn't know much about the rest of the world. He was a product of West Texas, and Vietnam to him was terra incognita. And I think that difference of contextual intelligence, in which he had great contextual intelligence for American domestic politics, but very inadequate contextual intelligence internationally, is an illustration of that. The same could be said not of one person, but of the two Bushes, Bush father and son. Bush father, Bush 41, as we sometimes call him, because he was the 41st president, had extraordinary contextual intelligence about international affairs. He'd served as head of the CIA. He'd been emissary in China, ambassador to the UN, and so forth. Whereas Bush 43, the son, really had never been outside of Texas much. I mean, he may have been to Mexico, but he certainly didn't know the world. And so that ability to have contextual intelligence is, I think, a key factor to being able to make sensible judgments about intended and unintended consequences.
And on the note of LBJ, especially in his first term from 63 to 64, a lot of people do credit him for the civil rights passage, but a lot of people do say it was JFK's initial work from 60 to 63 that helped lead the way. And if JFK had won a second term, civil rights would have passed. Looking at the period from 63 to 64, judging Johnson's performance in that period, how much of it was a carryover of this Kennedy legacy?
Well, Johnson was able to do what Kennedy couldn't do. Kennedy had great rhetoric on civil rights, but he didn't have the same capacity to get things through the Senate. And I don't think that, imagine that Kennedy hadn't been assassinated. I don't think he could have done in 64, 65 what Johnson did on civil rights. So in that sense, I think Johnson was on that dimension much better than Kennedy. Ironically, Kennedy, who gave a speech in American University after the Cuban Missile Crisis, saying that we had to step back from the brink and talk about arms control of the Soviets, and led to the first arms control treaty. He prepared the way for Johnson and the eventual negotiation, for example, of non-proliferation treaty in '68. So Kennedy was much better on the international side than Johnson. Johnson was better on the domestic side than Kennedy.
Later on in your book, you say that quote, even if China someday passes the US in total economic size, economic might is just part of the equation. China is well behind the US in military and soft power indices. It also highlights that at the US, while the US is ranked as one of the top soft power diplomacy countries, China is 26th. Maoist communism has far greater transition soft power appeal than Xi Jinping does today. Um, so basically, in regards to China's outreach, it's, as you said, no, it's currently ranked 26th. To put it in simplistic terms, do you think it's the brand China is selling, or is it the method in which they're promoting it across the world that's letting them down?
Well, I think China has a very difficult problem with soft power. I mean, it's interesting that they realize that it's important for them. I was particularly surprised, having developed the concept of soft power as an academic concept. I was amazed when in 2007, Hu Jintao told the 17th Party Congress that China had to develop its soft power. In the abstract, that makes a lot of sense. If your hard power, economic, military, is increasingly growing, you're going to scare your neighbors, and they're going to form coalitions against you. But if you can develop your soft power of attraction at the same time as your hard power, you look less threatening, and they're less concerned about creating these coalitions to balance your power. And I think in that sense, Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping has echoed this, was correct to say that China needs to develop soft power. And they've poured billions of dollars into this. Their problem is that they have two drawbacks. One is it's very hard to develop soft power in areas where you're claiming somebody else's territory. And China has real territorial disputes with many of its neighbors. India, where there were recent clashes between Chinese and Indian soldiers on the Himalayan borders. But with Vietnam, where there have been clashes over oil rigs in the Paracel Islands, or questions like the Senkaku Islands in Japan, where Chinese Coast Guard ships are constantly challenging Japanese ships. These things don't generate soft power. And in that sense, in Asia, the fact that China has conflicts with so many of its neighbors means that there's a limit on China's soft power. But outside of Asia, where there are no territorial conflicts, is another problem, which is a lot of a country's soft power comes from its civil society, not just from its government or government policies. And China, I mean, for example, American soft power comes as much from Hollywood and Harvard and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as it does from the Voice of America, or I would argue more so. Um, China has a wonderful culture and some brilliant artists and so forth, but it insists on tight party control of what they do. So Chinese film directors are subject to tight government Communist Party censorship. And when you have a genius like Ai Weiwei, uh, China winds up, jailing him or exiling him. And this inability to loosen up on party control, to allow civil society to play its full role, sets limits on Chinese soft power. So I think they're, for all that they talk about it, for all that it makes sense for them, I think they have these limits that are difficult to overcome in practice. I mean, if I go to the Australian case, I think China, stubbed its own toe with these 14 demands on Australia, and so in that sense, I think the Chinese are not very good at soft power, even though they know they need it.
Non-soft power, well, and China has, the Confucius Institute. Korea, Singapore, Japan also have extensive soft power programs, both state-run and through the cultural arts industry. Why do you think people misunderstand soft power? I know people have, for you especially, have tended to misconcept soft power as American hegemony. Um, and I'm always curious to know why that is, because there are very clearly other countries, especially here in this part of the region, that take part in the practice as well.
Well, I think the very often people think soft power is hard power in disguise, or either that, or sometimes say soft power is not very important because it's too soft. In fact, if you think of power, power is the ability to get what you want by influencing the behavior of others. And you can do that in three ways. You can do it with coercion, you can do it with payments, or you do it with attraction, getting others to want what you want. And that last is soft power. Soft power is the ability to get what you want without coercion or payment. And in that sense, I think it's important to realize that soft power is not the possession of any one country like the United States. I mean, the United States can do really stupid things and undercut its soft power. Most public opinion polls show that in the last 4 years, that Trump, with his narrow transactional approaches, has reduced American soft power. And I think in that sense, it's also interesting that small power countries like Singapore in Southeast Asia with only 5 million people, or like Norway in Europe with only 5 million people, have a fair degree of soft power. So it's not just American hegemony or the power of the United States in disguise. Essentially, it's the ability to do things that attract others, and that can come out of your culture, or your behavior at home, or your foreign policies when they're seen as legitimate in the eyes of others.
In times, and this will be heading to the last question now. You've always highlighted throughout your various books in reality how you need smart power and combining hard power and soft power. Do you think we'll get to a stage, I'm not sure how COVID impacts this, where soft power alone will be just required for countries to pursue their interests, and there'll be much more reliance on soft power rather than hard power?
Well, I think it's a mistake to think that soft power will replace hard power. The question is, can you combine soft and hard power in ways where they reinforce each other? And can you increase the amount of soft power that's involved? When you have a foreign policy, which I hope Biden will follow, which pays attention to alliances and multilateralism and the interests of others, you can increase your soft power, but you still need a degree of hard power. You can't just solve the problems, for example, of the South China Sea without having a strong naval force to challenge the freedom of navigation operations, challenge the Chinese claims to the South China Sea. So you need the hard power as well as the soft power. But if you have allies and you have a sense that your position is legitimate in the eyes of others, i.e., soft power, you're more likely to prevail than if you rely upon hard power alone. I've called this smart power, the ability to adapt and adjust your policies so that the hard and soft dimensions reinforce each other. But it's not very likely that the soft is going to totally replace the hard.
Professor Nye, thank you so much for your time. I know you have another function to head off to, so I won't keep you waiting, but thank you so much. This has been a big honor interviewing you. After researching and writing many essays on your work, it's an absolute pleasure to be having a discussion with you.
Well, it's a pleasure for me, and I enjoyed the questions, and good luck for your future.